Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Before we start the webinar, I'd just like to cover off some housekeeping. You are all in listen only mode, but if you'd like to submit a question, you can do so at any time during the webinar. Please type your questions in the questions field in the panel and send your question to all panelists. We'll aim to cover us as many as we can, but if time runs out, we'll follow up with you after today's webinar. This is being recorded, and links to the recording will be sent to you after today's presentation.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Everbridge webinar, Managing Multiple Threats, COVID-19 and Beyond. My name is Suzanne Cross, and I am the VP of Sales for Everbridge for Northern Europe. As UK and global businesses are coming to terms with the reality of COVID-19, including how to recover from it, it's important to remember that critical events don't take turns. They can and do strike at any time, simultaneously, a factor made more complex if your operations and people are spread across multiple sites and geographies. As we are gradually returning to some form of normality, be that returning to the work environment or a university or school campus, we all need to be prepared for the unexpected, which could include unpredicted events such as the unrest and fatal stabbing in Birmingham city centre recently, the shooting in Suffolk last week of a 15-year-old going to school, or the Extinction Rebellion protests lately bringing city and town centres to a halt, to name but a few that have happened while this pandemic endures. So for the next hour, I'll be joined by a number of critical event specialists who will provide insights on the threat landscape, actionable strategies, and the power of data to successfully steer through whatever the future might hold. So please welcome our keynote speaker, Mike Kroll, a global security advisor who has extensive experience in navigating organizations such as Facebook, the United Nations, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office through global critical events. Over to you, Mike.
So thank you, Suzanne, and a warm welcome to everyone who's tuned in today. I'd like to share some thoughts on crisis management, how it looks to the different generations, how they communicate, and how their expectations have developed. But you can't talk about the generations without mentioning The Who, seen here live in concert in 1970. Pretty raw, definitely analog, but they played great tunes. The generations that I'm going to talk about are Boomers, Generation X, Millennials, and the I generation. And if you're not sure which generation you are or which one you'd like to be, here's a simple guide. It's organized by the year in which you were born, the age range that you are now, and which Prime Minister and Doctor Who most represent your times. Boomers recall Margaret Thatcher and Tom Baker, Generation X, Tony Blair and Sylvester McCoy, Millennials, the two David, Cameron and Tennant, and the I generation, the two blondes, Boris Johnson and Jodie Whittaker. An important thing to consider here is what proportion of each generation are in your workforce, how do they view crises, and how do you connect with them? In case you were wondering, I'm a boomer, right at the tail end of being a boomer, but a boomer nonetheless. And you probably heard the one about boomers. How do boomers change a light bulb? They don't. They just keep talking about how great the old one was. But let's start by going even further back in time, to 1815 and the Battle of Waterloo. We're heading for the exit now, but back then we were more enthusiastic about Europe, and the Duke of Wellington led a coalition to save it from Napoleonic domination. It was one of the biggest events in our history, yet it took 3 days for the news to travel just 200 miles back to London. After the battle, Wellington wrote a letter to the Prime Minister describing the victory, and he gave it to his only unwounded ADC, aide-de-camp, Major Henry Percy, to deliver to Downing Street. Major Percy travelled by horse, sailing ship, and when that was becalmed in the Channel, he rowed the ship's gig to Ramsgate. From there, he took a horse and carriage to London. The momentous news had travelled at just 3 miles per hour. Now consider how news of Waterloo will be transmitted today. There is no time delay. The news is streamed live from TV cameras, smartphones, drones, social media, Fitbits, satellite images. We would be totally immersed in the experience. Major Percy doesn't have to carry a letter on a horse anymore, but that was as fast as news travelled throughout history until just 6 or 7 generations ago. We've stopped thinking of generations as the interval between being a child and having a child, so about 25 years. Today, we describe generations in terms of the technology that they grew up with. And we'll see that this is changing so fast that the intervals between generations is now only about 15 years, which means there are 4 generations in the workforce today. For each generation, I'll talk about their context, their communications, the crisis they're familiar with, and their expectations of crisis management. But let's start with my generation. Boomers grew up outside, playing hide and seek, building carts, lighting bonfires and climbing trees. We roamed the neighborhood all day. We had to be home before the street lights came on. Everyone walked to school. To be accompanied by your parents was a mark of shame. Our music came on crackling 12-inch vinyl discs, played at 33 revolutions per minute. The most popular car in the 70s was the Ford Cortina, but it wasn't until 1983 that seatbelts became compulsory, following the clunk click every trip campaign by that well-known safety guru, Jimmy Savile. The first image is not Vietnam, it's not Iran, it's the UK. We sometimes forget the 30-year crisis known as the Troubles, which killed 3,500 people. There was what was known as an acceptable level of violence, but at least back then, many bomb attacks were preceded by a telephone warning in an attempt to limit casualties. The 1980s was a decade of major disasters, and here you also see Hillsborough, when 96 football fans were crushed to death, and the Herald of Free Enterprise, the ferry that capsized in Zeebrugge, killing 193. Back then, the response to crises was improvised. Back then, the slogan, "keep calm and carry on," wasn't filled with irony. It was the fundamental approach to crisis management. The home phone was a novelty. We grew up making calls in red telephone boxes, feeding them with a pocket full of coins. In 1970, only 35% of households had phones. If anyone had told me that one day I couldn't live without a phone that played music and took photographs, I would have laughed at them. The magic machine for boomers was the fax. Feed it with paper, punch in a number, and a curlier, dimmer version would whir from a machine in another part of the world. That would have saved Major Percy a journey. Until 1982, there were only three TV channels. News came in 2 flavors, BBC or ITV, and at 2 times, 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. The BBC was so trusted, so authoritative, so familiar that it was known as Auntie Beeb. Our parents had been through the war. The clue's in the name. We are the post-war baby boom. In the UK, 40,000 people were killed in the Blitz and 2 million homes were damaged. For boomers, a stiff upper lip, a cup of tea and a cigarette would get them through a crisis. We believed what we were told. We trusted the authorities, and we regarded improvisation as entirely normal. The new expectation of crisis management following various mix-ups was that the dead would be correctly identified and returned to their families. For this, a new branch of science, forensic odontology, was developed. And Generation X. This was the first generation to grow up wearing a helmet whilst riding a bicycle. It was also the first generation to be born in homes with central heating and hot and cold running water, the first generation to take a shower. They were also the first with portable music in the form of the Sony Walkman, made famous by Kevin Bacon. Yes, you Xers still remember that tune. Footloose, footloose, kick off the Sunday shoes. And the Golf GTI was the cool car to aspire to. For Generation X, the big crisis was, of course, 9/11. Epic in scale and consequence, the unforgettable image of the Twin Towers collapsing in a ball of fire and smoke against the blue September sky. There were also terror attacks closer to home, including the 7/7 bombings in London. This time, there were no telephone warnings, only suicide bombers intent on causing maximum casualties. And in 2005, there was the Boxing Day tsunami that killed over 220,000 people across the Indian Ocean, including 149 British citizens. I was in the Foreign Office at the time, and we were totally overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis. Whilst it was a single event, it was essentially multiple crises, with British nationals killed, injured, or missing in Thailand, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, and Malaysia. The FCO recognized that its improvised responses were inadequate, and the tsunami was a catalyst to develop a dedicated crisis team with a 24/7 response capability. The United Nations also developed a network of sensors to detect tsunamis and issue automated evacuation alerts to coastal areas. Generation Xers grew up with 24/7 TV news. For boomers, not only was the TV news on just twice a day, the TV stopped at midnight with the playing of the national anthem and the presenter reminding you to put out the cat and the empty milk bottles. Rolling news was the new normal. All the news from everywhere, all the time. Being first for breaking news often meant being never wrong for long, as they struggled to balance speed with accuracy. The first mobile phones appeared in the late 1980s. How many of you have used the Motorola 4500? It was known as the brick phone rather than the bat phone. Remember those early conversations, feeling self-conscious and important? I'm on a train, whilst all the other passengers glared at you. Generation Xers were also the first to enter the workplace with computers instead of typewriters. A computer back in the day was about the size of a suitcase and used floppy disks. Mention a floppy disk to a millennial these days and you're likely to be arrested. Those heartbreaking images of missing people notices after 9/11 showed how important it was to locate everyone in a crisis. The solution came in the form of the new mobile phone. Telephone trees were used to account for people. The boss would call her team, they would call their team, and everyone would be accounted for. That was the theory anyway. I remember doing using a telephone tree to account for 65 staff in Berlin following the 2016 Christmas attack. It took 4 days before we located the last person. And for victims, a cup of tea was served not with a cigarette, but with sympathy, and a more compassionate approach to crisis management emerged. Millennials have grown up cycling, not only with helmets, but also with day-glow vests and safety flags, and with constant adult supervision. How does this frame their expectation of crisis management if they've always been accompanied by their parents? A key aspect is that once people are used to a certain level of safety, they don't want to lose it. That's the baseline for them to build on. Ask a snowflake, a millennial, how safe is safe enough? And they'll answer, it's never enough. Millennials grew up with CDs rather than vinyl, but they soon took to the iPod, which was released in 2001, and the iPhone, which came out six years later. They haven't been in a music store since. They download music. 100 vinyl albums weighs 22 kilograms. An iPhone can store 1,000 albums and it still only weighs 138 grams. And the music on it doesn't get scratched. And millennials felt safer in an SUV than a GTI. Even if it was a squeeze in multi-story car parks, bigger meant safer. And crises for a millennial include the 2010 Icelandic volcano. It took me ages to learn this, but it was called Eyjafjallajökull, which shut down flights all over Europe for 8 days. Now, I was trying to host a conference on crisis management at the time, with people traveling to London from 40 countries. In essence, it was a simple crisis and no one was hurt. The emergency services weren't even needed, but it was immensely hard to keep track of everyone amongst all the disruption. And then the Arab Spring of 2011 with mass demonstrations across the Middle East. At the Foreign Office, the issue was to understand what was going on, with news pouring in so fast. Establishing ground truth was a massive challenge, even in an organization whose core business is understanding what's going on. Information needed to be disseminated to a variety of groups, to ministers, consular staff, crisis management teams, embassy staff, the families of embassy staff, EU partners, contractors, host nation authorities, the press, and of course, British nationals living and traveling in affected countries. We managed the crisis using emails. I still remember the thousands of mails marching across my screen. They were forwarded or replied to so often that the subject was often obscured by a row of forward, and the text became so small that it was unreadable. We were so overloaded with information that much of it, I'm ashamed to admit, went unprocessed, and people's confidence in our management was severely tested at times. And the 2017 Manchester Arena bombing that killed 23. After any event of that nature, the first question for any organization is, are my staff okay? They don't want to wait 4 days for answers. In those circumstances, even 4 hours feels like a long time as anxiety builds. Millennials started out analog, but they quickly went digital. Soon they were moving their thumbs more than they moved their lips. They live in an ocean of connections, information, music, images, videos, dating, shopping, banking, gaming. They have access to multiple news sources, but their trust in them is limited. They rely more on news passed through their own networks, and they view email as boomer comms. They like the speed and conciseness of SMS or messaging, and they value pace more than they value grammar. No more improvised crisis management. Millennials expect an immediate, fully scaled and competent response. Millennials get their news through their smartphones rather than the TV, so they expect alerts delivered to them telling them what's going on and what they should do. They look to their employer to provide regular, trusted information. They expect more than just tea and sympathy, more than just compassion. They expect organizations to take a systematic approach to duty of care. They expect accountability. As well as a stress counselor, they may well ask for a lawyer. The I generation grew up online. They're digital natives. They were using smart devices before they could tie a shoelace. The I generation are woke, alert to injustice, and they instinctively challenge the status quo. They mistrust authority. A life skill for a boomer was being able to use an electric drill to put up a shelf. A life skill for the I generation is being able to install a firewall and a VPN. The I generation are alert to microaggressions. You had to be very careful saying things like, "Where are you from?" It can be very easy to offend the I generation. And this is baffling to boomers who grew up with robust interactions and a beating if you broke the rules. In English state schools, corporal punishment was only banned in 1986. In public schools, where apparently some boys grew to enjoy it, it wasn't banned until 1998. And downloading is yesterday's tech. They want to stream music rather than buy it. If they want a car, it might be a Tesla, but they probably prefer the flexibility of Zipcar or Uber or an electric scooter, and they look forward to autonomous vehicles. They don't care for driving, they just want to be transported. And remember how boomers walked to school? The I generation are driven to school, and in some parts of the world, a good parent sends their child off with a bulletproof backpack just in case someone starts shooting. This generation is serious about safety and security. For the I generation, the world is VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Crises for them will play out online in real time, and any interruption of the internet will be a major crisis in itself. Climate change and population growth mean more severe natural disasters, flooding, hurricanes, earthquakes, forest fires, affecting ever greater numbers of people. Remember, the global population is increasing by 7 million every month. That's equivalent to a new London being created every 4 weeks. Movements like Extinction Rebellion are fueled by this generation. For them, it's, okay, boomer, you've melted the ice, you've thinned out the atmosphere, you've eaten all the fish. This is the age of Greta Thunberg, not Greta Garbo. And pandemic for them is the new normal. They don't go anywhere without their emergency kit, a face mask, latex gloves, hand gel, and a mobile phone to receive alerts. Boomers didn't go anywhere without cigarettes, a handkerchief, and some change for the telephone. With the pandemic, we're past the first wave. The challenge is now to manage the whack-a-mole scenario with infection rates popping up at different places at different times. Pandemic regulations are changing, sometimes overnight. Travel restrictions and local quarantines are imposed. Rules are hard to follow. And amongst all of this, how do you keep your staff safe and compliant? How can you communicate with staff? How do you know when your offices are at capacity? How do you trace people in your organization who may have been in contact with someone who was infected? How do you support business travel? As it gets harder to distinguish between real news and fake news, staff look to their employers to provide authoritative information. Employers need to cut through the blizzard of information, work out what's relevant to the various categories of staff, and inform them and keep them updated. You need to do this swiftly, and you can only do this if you have a dedicated team available to manage your crisis 24/7 or an automated system. The I generation are hyper-connected. They don't use established networks, they share information with their friends. They put themselves at the center of their own news story. News dissemination used to be periodic and controlled. Now it's spectacularly incontinent. Everyone used to get 15 minutes of fame. TikTok gives you 1 minute, Snapchat gives you 10 seconds. We live in the attention economy. To get read, you have to be ABC, accurate, brief, and clear. The I generation are comfortable sharing their data with Siri, Instagram, Strava, Uber, and Tinder. They're early adopters of augmented and virtual reality. They're happy to wear technology that measures their heart rate, temperature, sleep patterns, and distance run, cycled, or swam. Boomers believe in need to know. iGen believe in need to share. They value access to information more than they value their privacy. The I generation expects everything, everywhere to be monitored all the time using the latest technology. They expect emergency services to be dispatched on the basis of automated data from their wearable devices. They assume a broad definition of duty of care, especially with a more dispersed workforce and more home working. Within the information blizzard, they expect accurate real-time information that's simple to understand, tailored to their individual circumstances, and delivered via a channel that they instinctively use. They expect their mental health to be managed as closely as their physical health. And they know that size and strength might have been effective in the past, but that speed and agility are the keys to organizational resilience in the future. Now, that was a canter across 4 generations, and I think you'll agree that the changes have been quite extraordinary. We've moved, and if we just take a look at the difference between boomer comms and iGeneration comms. So we moved from phones that you step into to phones that you wear, from faxes to selfies, and from Angela telling us what's going on twice a day to Alexa, to us asking Alexa for the latest at any time of day. Not only are things changing, they're changing faster. Now, here's a graphic that shows how long it took to get to 50 million users. It took 68 years for 50 million people to start using airlines, 14 years for 50 million people to get a mobile phone, but only 19 days for 50 million people to download Pokemon Go. Our challenge is to move with the times. We have to recognize that generations are more diverse, and as a workforce, they're more dispersed. Communications, there are now multiple channels, and the messages need to be targeted to individuals. And expectations are growing. Immediacy, competence, and sensitivity are the order of the day, not just from the emergency services, but crucially from employers too. The underlying theme is increasing speed. And if you find all of this change bewildering, spare a thought for Major Percy. And just one final thought. Whilst much is changing, the basic principles of crisis management, planning, preparedness, and leadership, like a good tune, remain constant throughout the generations. Thank you.
Welcome to this demonstration of the Critical Event Management Platform from Everbridge. What I'd like to do first is to focus on a critical event that most organisations are having to deal with at this particular time due to the COVID pandemic. As the COVID situation varies around the world and across regions, decisions are being made to progressively reopen specific offices or regions. There are tasks that need to be achieved for compliance and with local regulations, and most organisations have a handle on this. However, Everbridge can provide the information and automate much of this process for you. It's hard to bring people back to work safely, and the most challenging elements to achieve this are, firstly, stopping sick people coming to the office. Next is limiting the building population density to comply with the social distancing regulations. And finally, in the event of an employee becoming infected, being able to quickly identify who they may have come into contact with and contain the situation rapidly. Let's start with the first one, stopping sick people coming into the office. The Everbridge platform allows you to create additional information in people's profiles that allow you to then filter out those who have self-deemed themselves as not fit to come to work for various reasons. There seem to be several approaches to this, either by explicitly asking them if they are unsafe to come to work due to having been exposed to COVID-19, or, as we're seeing more commonly, organisations like the idea of providing guidance in the form of a document to their employees, and then simply asking them the question, do you comply and therefore are able to come to work, or do you not comply and therefore cannot come to work? So the first thing we do is we're able to send out an incident notification to our employees to make sure that they have the ability to complete that question about whether they are fit or not to come to work. We can do that simply by sending out a notification asking them to respond, or we can provide them with the ability to update their details using the member portal. This can be achieved just by using the Safety Connect buttons and selecting something like this that will point them directly to the member portal and allow them to update their details to display whether they are fit to come to work or not. So here is an example here where the information is simply asking whether they're eligible to return to work or not, and they can edit this as their situation changes. Once you've established who is able to come back to work, we then need to start addressing that situation where our office of, say, a 300-person capacity has been reduced down to 100 people due to social distancing. You may put in place some kind of scheduling where people come in on alternate days or different days during the week. But essentially, if we send out a notification to try and establish who is able to come into work on a particular day, we can then add in that a fill count, allowing us to automatically have a quota filled for that office for that day. The beautiful part about this part of the system is that the approval to return to work can be automated. So what we'll do here is we'll send out a notification. We're going to send it out to a group of people, and they will then receive a notification asking them to respond as to whether they're able to come to work or not. Once they receive the notification, they select. In this case, we're asking detailed questions, which we could simplify to just say, do you qualify? And if they select no in their response, they will then be automatically authorized if they have not responded before the fill count has been completed. So here I have my return to work approval confirmation. I can then select that as a notification, and you'll see that we have provided a very graphical approval for returning to the office. All of this information obviously is stored within the Everbridge system should the HR department or other department want to review who has been authorized to come back to the office. The last challenge is dealing with staff who have become infected with COVID and potentially created an exposure event. In this case, we can track where users have been using the information that they've provided or where they work to find out where they are. I'm going to show you how this works by examining this user here called Wilkinson. As you can see, Diane has a profile in the system. If I select her profile, you will see within here I have a location history report. Let's select that. We select the date range that we are going to examine their locations for. So I'm going to do the last 14 days, and we can scan. So Diane has reported to us that she is now infected or may be infected, and what we've done is run a report to show us any potential contacts that she's come into contact with, or any potential people she's come into contact with over the last 14 days. And from here we can very quickly notify those contacts that they should report themselves as not eligible to come to the office potentially for the next 14 days to make sure that we don't have any further exposure events. So that's shown you how to do these things through a simple form. What I want to do now is take you to a critical event. So if we wanted to launch a critical event based around us opening the office in London, we can do that very quickly. And remember, our critical events come with task lists for various different teams and groups. We also provide the notifications so that you can send out notifications as people progress through opening the office. And let me launch this so that we can then see the event in action. So our critical event has been launched. We've launched a task list. Once the tasks have been launched, notifications are sent out to those people who are responsible for various tasks, and they can access those tasks through the mobile app. Now, the nice thing about this is as they complete their tasks or mark them as in progress, The people managing the event can see in real time that these tasks are being updated. Notice that within here we also have those notifications that we may want to send out on a daily basis. So this event could live for some time, allowing us to manage the successful reopening of our office and reduce the possibility of any exposure events. The final part of this would be the documentation that you can provide, which is also stored within the mobile app and available to those that it's distributed to. So using the CEM platform, we can provide you with all the tools that you'll need to help and aid you in successfully reopening your office. Let's take this out from a different perspective and let's have a look at the world view. So CEM provides you with the visual command center. And just to relate it to the event that we kicked off earlier, let me show you all the critical events that we've currently got in this organization running around the world. If you remember, one of them was a critical event to do with opening an office. If I open that critical event, you can see here the event that's running, and we can drill down and we can see the tasks that have been associated to that event, and we can also see updates to those tasks in real time as they occur. So very much a single pane of glass view that allows you to see all the events that are occurring in your organization at any one time. Unlike a return to work critical event, most critical events are unplanned for, and they happen because a risk event has happened that impacts potentially one of our assets. And that could be buildings, it could be contacts, it could be supply chains. When those risk events affect our assets, that's when a critical event happens and we receive alerts. The system will automatically take these risk events from various different sources and then will feed those into the system, providing us with the alerts. Operators will see these alerts pop up and they can then take action upon them based on whether they are impacting one of our assets and the severity of that alert. Here we have an alert for an issue going on in Orpington in Greater London. And from here, if I need to, I can view that with regards to the potentially affected contacts. I can look at the potential supply chain issues and any other assets that may be affected. If I deem this to be a serious enough event, I can very quickly and easily launch a new critical event from this platform, which will then go through the process of allowing us to initiate the plans, those making up from task lists to communications that we may need to send out, as well as documents that could provide information about what to do in this type of event. Returning to our return to work scenario that we were discussing at the beginning, there are additional context layers that allow you to help assess the current ongoing changing situation. And we provide those from various different sources. For example, here are the COVID impacts that we might want to look at. And that could be an impact summary showing us the impact of COVID on a particular country. It could also look at any states of emergency. France is currently in a state of emergency. It may be new case trends showing where we've got increasing trends of infection. And all of this information is available as part of the CEM platform from Everbridge. So let me finish by saying thank you very much for watching this presentation, and I hope it's been useful to you.
Well, thank you, Mark and Mike. It's really great demo and a really thought-provoking keynote. I'm not going to personally offer up what generation I'm in, but I still have my Sony Walkman. I'm leaving it there. Anyway, I'd now like to introduce you all to our distinguished panel for the Q&A session. So hopefully we're all coming on. Yeah, so I can see everybody. So thank you. So let me welcome John, James, Owen and Charlotte to the panel. Can I ask you to briefly introduce yourselves, where you're from? So let's start with John.
Hello, it's John Ludlow, and I'm the CEO of IC. And in a previous life, I used to be the Senior Vice President of IHG, Control Company.
Thank you, John. James.
Hello, my name is James Ide. I work as a crisis management consultant with Control Risks here in London.
Excellent, thanks, James. Charlotte?
Hi, my name is Charlotte McGarity. I am a senior security consultant at Control Risks as well. Previously, I worked at Deloitte in the resilience and crisis management team.
Excellent, thanks, Charlotte. And Owen?
Thank you. I'm Owen Miles, Technical Director from Everbridge, and I've worked in the critical event management space for coming up 15 years now.
Great. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for joining. So let me go to the first question. So Mike has talked about how the expectations, especially of his employees, have changed over time. Could you share your experience of how this has changed in your organisation or the organisations or businesses that you work with? So let's start with you, Charlotte.
So I think obviously it's a really interesting topic, and the fact that we do see such diverse generations now within the workplace. I think in terms of the organisation, so for Control Risk, the expectation around sort of flexible working, that's been something that's always been very attributed to the sort of millennial I generation, that we want this more flexible working hours, ability to work from different locations. Interestingly, I would say that what we found within our team is COVID-19 seems to have kind of flipped that on its head a bit. We did a internal team kind of survey, and it found that actually the millennial generation and then the I generation were the ones that were most keen to return to the office. And it was the boomer and Generation X that wanted to stay remote working. So it kind of goes against the trend of what we always hear, that it's the millennials, I generation that are the ones that want to not necessarily be tied to an office. I think the reason for that is very much that the kind of, in our team especially, the younger people, the younger members of the team, they don't have the space at home to have a home office set up. One of my colleagues, he works in a shared house, lives in a shared house with 5 other people, so has essentially been working from his bedroom for 6 months. So this has been, really interesting for us, I think, as an organisation, to understand that despite the almost kind of media around the fact that it's meant to be the millennial I generations that want to be working from home, in reality, it's a little bit different.
Yeah, absolutely. You might hear my dog barking in the background, so that shows how different it can be. So how about you, Owen? What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, my experience working with companies and certainly in the delivery of critical event management solutions, I've definitely seen a significant change. In fact, I recall many years ago speaking with a customer who I won't name about communications with employees, and then saying actually they wouldn't send a message out to people as they don't need to know. And I think organizations have started to realize that you really can't hold back information any longer. And if you choose not to share it, essentially you're creating an information vacuum that someone is going to fill. So actually you're much better off to communicate early, be as honest and open as you can be, and use that as an opportunity to tell people what you're doing, and indeed capture responses from them. So actually, unfortunately, companies have limited resources, so we need to focus those on those people that need our assistance. But this isn't just for the critical event messaging, but it's also business as usual communications. IT outages happen, but actually if we can communicate out so that employees understand what's going on, it empowers them. And there is that expectation for quick and effective communication. And interestingly, organizations aren't there yet. So Everbridge commissioned a report, it's called Clarity Out of Chaos, which was released earlier this year. And obviously I'm not going to talk about all of it, but pulling out a couple of key points was that 70% of our responders agreed that communication should be more frequent, two-way, or more detailed. And over 2/3 would like their employers to do more. So I think expectations have changed, but actually organizations still need to do a bit of catch up.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree with you there. And that's a great report for anyone that wants it. It's on our website. So a bit of an advertisement there. Sorry. So John, over to you. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think since 9/11, really, the duty of care, has grown and grown and grown. And I think board directors, there's an expectation that they will have oversight as to what's going on in the world and what's going on in their organisation and where their people and assets are. I think that's quite a change. I think what's had to happen is that they've had to build capability to cope with a broader and broader range of issues because the terrorism threat hasn't gone away. In fact, it's evolved and it's continually evolved and is going still. But there's a much broader range of risks, as we're aware now, from medical issues to all the natural disasters that are seemingly coming one after the other with climate change as that threat evolves. But it's also some travel disruption, and certainly the newer generations expect to be helped out when the train doesn't run and things like that. But also crime, and that continues to evolve. I think your presentation earlier on was absolutely on the money. And I certainly remember all of those generational shifts. The only thing I will say is that just because you're born in the sort of oldest generation doesn't mean you haven't adapted and evolved. And actually, certainly in my organisation now, it's the oldest generation that's driving the innovation quite often. And the younger generations are often resisting change, which causes some frustration. But I think new capabilities, broader capabilities have to be built by companies. I think the key one is for companies to be risk intelligent and understand what's going on. And I think reorganisation and control risks are absolutely vital to help in that capability building. But once you've got that and you've got a risk intelligent organisation, you then need to train your employees appropriately, different roles, different situations that they're going to get into. And as those situations change. So training is critical. And then lastly, is corporate discipline. And that comes from leadership. So actually the leaders have to comply these days, whereas in the old days, I think it was one rule for them and a different rule for everybody else. So it's that discipline to get yourself trained, become aware, and to take the mitigation actions that you're expected to do. So that's pretty much it, but it's changed enormously, and I'm sure it will carry on changing as the generations come out.
Yeah, great points, John. And as people say, change is the only constant, isn't it, in this business? So that's why we're all here. So finally, James, over to you. Have you got anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I think we've all had our expectations massively changed as a result of COVID. As an individual, we deliver a lot of face-to-face training, or have done in the past. So, we had to rapidly sort of embrace this change. I was talking about embracing chaos earlier today, and someone said, if you recommend that, do people punch you for it? And I think it was a just understanding that what does embrace chaos mean? And I think what it means about it is recognizing that this is serious, putting your arms around it, looking for the opportunity, and rather than bringing fear and anxiety to the situation, I think it means bringing honesty and bringing compassion to the situation and looking for those opportunities that exist, because we can't avoid the chaos. So what other options do we have? And I just think this concept of embracing chaos, embracing the problems that we have, that's what it means. It means facing up to them and bringing our compassion to them. And I think those are the kind of things that the guide for me in that is obviously the Kubler-Ross change curve, where you've got fear and anxiety on one side and experimentation and opportunity on the other. And whenever I find myself in a sort of anxiety or frustration, I recognize that I'm on the wrong side of the curve and I need to move to experimentation, trying stuff out, and working with others and helping, and either asking for support or giving it.
Great answers, James. Yeah, and I think compassion's the key word here as well. So that's a really good point, especially when people are going through multiple disasters and managing multiple events happening at the same time, quite possibly as they are today.
And with these generations, I think again, it's less about what we've got, everything that separates us and makes us different, and it's all about identifying those things that we're all sharing and going through at the moment. And bringing those different skills and abilities to bear in a good team approach. That's always better than an individual approach.
Yeah, absolutely. No, great. No, thanks for your answers, guys. It's really interesting. So let me pass on to the next question, given interest of time. So So my question is, do you feel the overall all threats resilience will be driven further up the executive agenda following COVID? Or will organisations just keep on trying to cope with events as they occur? So what are your thoughts on that? So maybe I'll start with you, John, on that one.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's all about risk maturity, isn't it? If you want to live dangerously, just deal with the event today and don't worry about it. But actually, what's changed, I think, fundamentally, is that the risks are now very connected. You think about COVID, you think about climate change, you think about cyber risk. All of these big risks that are on our sort of radar and on our plate today are very connected. You know, when one starts to happen, when it crystallizes, it actually impacts all the other risks on your risk register. So that's one of the things we've been telling people to go do, is refresh the risk register through the eyes of COVID, or through the eyes of climate, through the eyes of cyber, because all of these things are very connected. And that really means that when one starts to happen, we have to refresh the whole thing. But the other thing that people need to realize is that corporations are also connected. So you've got global corporations with, you know, sort of global strategies, global departments, you know, and when something happens in China, it doesn't stay in China anymore. It hits you all over the world in different ways. And so, yes, we live in much more dangerous and volatile times, and we need to understand that. So, not investing in risk management, not moving your risk maturity curve, is frankly dangerous and silly. So, we need to embrace it.
Yeah, absolutely, John. And I think the world is sadly getting smaller and smaller, isn't it? So we need to be on top of that as we move forward. So no, great answer, John. So Charlotte, what are your thoughts on this?
I agree with John. I think it's definitely something that we hear a lot of clients are looking to achieve, as they always say that they want to have this sort of all resilience, very mature model. Interestingly, though, I've been embedded at a large tech firm for the last 2 years, and even though COVID is obviously a global crisis, they have elected to take it as very much a regional crisis response. So they are not implementing a consistent, cohesive global response to COVID, which for us kind of sitting on the outside, we think seems maybe not the best approach, considering how interconnected everything is and how they should really be looking to have this global response, and the kind of lack of data that it means that they're getting on a global scale. So even though it's something that clients often ask us for and are definitely seeking, in reality, I'm not sure how much that will change on the back of what's happened recently, or whether clients will still continue to adopt more regional, country, more siloed approaches to crisis.
I guess time will tell, Charlotte, won't it, as we move further on. But no, that's a good response. It's quite interesting to see how different organisations are tackling this. So Owen, what are your thoughts on this point?
Yes, I mean, you know, I think that all threats resilience has to be much higher up the executive agenda. I mean, certainly my experience is that most organizations are concerned about dealing with multiple simultaneous critical events, essentially stress testing their organization resilience. Well, the bad news is that COVID-19 has meant that any critical event that takes place is a stress test. And certainly as we move into a new normal, organizations will inevitably look at, if they've not already done so, the cost of the pandemic, and particularly around those first few months where many organizations were trying to work out how to respond without a plan, and counting up the countless days, if not weeks, of potentially months of lost productivity, and the financial and inevitable reputational cost associated with that. And certainly my experience of talking to organizations over the past few months, it's definitely cemented in organizations' minds that they need procedures and processes in place in advance to ensure their resilience, and that they need that plan in a system that's going to automate those responses in a centralized location to speed up that process. I go back to a comment I made earlier about limited resources. You know, it's highly unlikely organizations are going to get more resource given some of the financial risks in the world at the moment. So companies need to do more with what they have to be able to provide global governance and information flow both upstream to the SMT and board and downstream to employees. So yeah, absolutely.
No, thanks, Owen. Yeah, it has been quite insightful as COVID has hit to see, sadly, how many organisations have no plans, or they have plans that are sitting on a shelf somewhere under a bunch of dust that they need to get off the shelf and
Indeed.
remind themselves what they are. So yeah, so I completely agree. I mean, it's something to definitely be looked at. So to James, finally to you, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's the difference between reacting and responding. And that reaction, if you're walking down the street and someone punches you in the face, you're going to fall down. Whereas if you're a boxer, if you're anticipating it, you're going to punch the other guy back before he punches you in the face. Responding means having some sort of adaptive capacity in place that you can implement. And that's very different from reacting. And from the organizations, nobody had a COVID response plan in place that said, for the next 6 to 8 months to 12 months, 24 months, there's going to be massive disruption. But those that had a pandemic response plan in place, at least gave them in those critical, acute phases of the crisis that confidence that somebody had thought about it and had put something in place. We toil in obscurity to be ready.
Absolutely, James. Yes, well, no punching in the face on this webinar, I must say. But we can say that COVID has punched a lot of organisations we're working with in the face. Nobody saw this.
It really has.
But we're absolutely seeing, certain companies thrive and survive through this, and others sadly not. So yeah, no, really, really good answers, guys. So let me move on in the interest of time. So third question. Yeah, very much on this point. So we're seeing more organisations are expecting a high percentage of their employees to work from home on a longer term basis, or work from more flexible locations such as serviced offices, customer sites, or even coffee shops. So how will you know where your employees are, or how will you advise companies you're working with to know where their employees are? And will this present a greater or lesser challenge to organisational resilience and the whole duty of care topic? So let's start with Charlotte on that one.
Thanks, Suzanne. I think in terms of that, there's definitely going to be an increased emphasis on duty of care, and it's going to be a lot harder for companies to find out where all their employees are. There's going to be a greater level of trust, I think, and communication between employees and their managers. So, for example, am I going to ring my manager and let him know I'm going to work from a coffee shop on a Thursday afternoon? Probably not, but in the interest of what's happening at the moment, maybe that's something that you have to start getting your employees to kind of get into the routine of. Obviously, there's the technology, emergency locator, mass notification systems that can be used to address this. I think that then there poses another question to your employees as well, is around the privacy concerns. I know that some people may feel that they're almost being tracked by their companies if you need to let them know where you are at any point, or if you have an app on your phone. So I think there needs to be a very strong piece around communications if a company is to adopt a technology or a tool like this, to make sure that those privacy concerns are addressed for your employees.
Yeah, absolutely, Charlotte. And we're seeing a lot of apps out there that can monitor, track, trace where your employees are. But yeah, I agree with you. These need to be landed correctly so that they are adopted in the most appropriate way possible. So John, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I just build on that really. I mean, we don't let people go onto building sites without steel boots and hard hats. I don't think we should let people work for us in dangerous parts of the world without, a contact tracing system. Just going to be part of what's going to become acceptable. I think the apps, particularly, reputable ones like yours, they maximise the privacy settings, and you're only going to go and look where somebody else is when you need to. So once that's clearly understood and there's trust and that's communicated, I think it's absolutely fine. I mean, clearly mobile apps are the way to go. I'm sure Everbridge do all of that, and but I think the main hurdle to implementation is about having systems, yes, but also the people capability to run those systems, and then the culture set down by the CEO and the board and lived by them to actually implement the change in ways of working that are necessary.
Yeah, absolutely, John. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it is culture, communications. All of those things are really, really important to ensure these land well. And I'm sure Owen can probably talk about what we do at Everbridge. So over to you, Owen, on this question.
Oh, no, thank you. And actually, even before COVID, organizations had a significant challenge in correlating assets, their people, their supply chains, their buildings, to risk events, and understanding and assessing at a hyper-local level that risk. And actually, does that risk impact their assets? Well, with COVID, those organizations that could work from home did, but this actually made things worse. Organizations have gone from a relatively few office locations, maybe in the tens or the hundreds of locations where the environment is heavily controlled. We've got security teams, we have badge access control systems, and only authorized staff having access. So an ecosystem with significantly more complexity. For many companies, they had a separate office for each employee, meaning that they had thousands of work locations that need to be protected. Not just from physical threats, having relatively insecure locations for IT equipment means significantly more risk for cyber attack. So historically, organizations only needed to protect their office and their travelers. However, as we move into this new normal, where companies have reassessed their property portfolio requirements and enabled, if not encouraged, staff to work from home and work remotely, I think these challenges have increased, and organizations need to be able to protect their employees where they're working to ensure that organization resilience and fulfill their duty of care while absolutely preserving their employee privacy.
Yeah, absolutely, Owen. Those great points. And finally, across to you, James, what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, just to say that, we look at crisis, we're looking at things that are certain and things that are uncertain, and there are totally predictable elements of any crisis, and the need to respond with a communication system that is rapid, safe, and trusted is absolutely paramount. And I think back to this sort of resilient organization is made up of resilient individuals. And so it's coming back to this sort of two-way communication. It's about protecting employees, yes, but it's a two-way responsibility. And it's also seeing that as a two-way communication process for employees who are often really well placed to inform senior levels of management or, other employees about what's happening around them and seeing them, and that ability to communicate is absolutely critical. So that's why we're all here on the webinar today. Owen's talked wisely about it, and we've got the demonstration. But that ability, not only in a critical event situation, to be able to rapidly identify where your employees are, but using safe, reliable communication tools is a critical response capability that organizations need, and expectations must and will. Employees will expect that to be happening.
Absolutely, James. Yeah, rapid, safe, and trusted. I like that. That's exactly on the money there. So, guys, we're coming up to the last couple of minutes, so if we can keep our responses short on this one before we cut off. So, the last question: what do you think are the main risks for businesses here in the UK in the next 6 months? And what would be your advice to navigate through these? I know it's a really deep topic, and I'm looking for a quick answer on these ones. So, maybe start with you, James, on this one.
I think that, a lot of the things that are happening at the moment, fraud, cyber, demonstrations, we're going to see a lot more of that happening. There's, civil unrest and commotion. So those are the predictable elements. I think we can guarantee another unpredictable event happening as well. I think that's another guarantee. So that ability to anticipate and work through, and I would just look at contingency planning, scenario planning, looking at the good, the bad, and the ugly options, and having that conversation before you need to.
Absolutely. Owen, over to you.
Yeah, I would echo what James has said. Obviously with COVID, there's a significant risk of recession, maybe even global recession, and companies needing to do more with what they have. So basically ensuring the right tools are in place, ensuring processes are automated, taking those standard operating procedures and workflows and making sure they're in place to support the organizations in their response, to do more with what they have, to respond more effectively and efficiently, and keep their people safe and operations running faster.
Great. Charlotte, what would you say to that?
Yes, I'd agree. I think cyber and protests would definitely be two of the main things that are threatening UK companies over the next 6 months. Similarly, making sure that you've got the correct tools and definitely the correct training and resourcing to be able to use those tools effectively would be the best advice to the companies.
Brilliant. And John, some last words from you?
Yeah, okay, so it's more of the same really. You've got COVID and then you've got the cascade from COVID, so you've got the economic fallout, you've got the social fallout, which may end up with some disruption and people get really unhappy. I think you've got cyber absolutely is there. Climate change is also there, and the thing with climate change, it isn't, it's not just the sort of the slow burn of climate change, it's also the social reaction to it as well. So companies that don't actually adapt and understand and empathise and change their behaviour around climate are going to not going to get the support of society going forwards. And then, of course, I'm sorry, it's the hard Brexit is coming very quickly.
Absolutely. And sadly, the end of this webinar has come very quickly. So on that note, we've come to the top of the hour. So let me just thank everybody for joining. Thank you to the panel and the presenters. Hopefully you've agreed this has been a thought-provoking session. If you have submitted a question, sorry, we haven't got round to you, but somebody in the team will come back to you. So again, from Everbridge and the whole team here, thank you very, very much for joining. Stay safe and have a fantastic afternoon. Thanks very much.